Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, everyone. Today, we have a special guest, Lindy Burton, who is the lovely wife of Dr. Mark Burton. And Lindy is what's called an LCSW. And for those of you who don't know, that is a licensed clinical social worker. And she works with Dr. Burton in their counseling center. So, Lindy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay. Hello, and I'm glad to be here. And a little bit about me. Well, as Liz said, I'm Mark's wife. So I've been working professionally with children and adolescents and adults, but a lot of children, certainly, and a lot of parents with parenting issues for over 20 years. And then, of course, we're the parents to 4 children and the grandparents to 4 grandchildren. And so we get a lot of grandparenting and parenting. We get to see and deal with these issues we're going to be talking about a lot of the time because we have our grandchildren with us 2 full days of the week. And we did through the entire COVID. So we got that experience of all day long, all 4 kids and doing their school and doing the parenting part. So
it's a tough job.
Yeah, it really makes me appreciate the parenting because it's so much easier actually to be the therapist. You can stand back and see things so much more objectively than you can when you're right in it.
Yeah, as I'm sure you experienced raising your own kids when they were young. Okay,
Yeah.
So we are going to talk today about difficult conversations with kids and particularly how to talk to kids about difficult things. So what we're going to start with is how to talk to kids about suicide. And the reason we're bringing up this specific topic is after I did the episode with Dr. Adrienne Burton Denmark on suicide, a listener reached out to me and said that in her experience in suicide culture, what happens is people tend to lie to children about that, which doesn't sound very effective to me. So we're going to talk about how to talk to kids about suicide and what do you tell them about suicide?
Okay, I am so glad you're asking about this. And I would like to start maybe even taking a backup step and talk about the framework for parents around approaching any difficult subject with children.
Okay.
Because it is built into us as parents. We love our kids. They come into this world, and when they cry, everything in us wants to protect them and make things better. And so, good, caring parents have this whole protective, nurturing side. So what happens when difficult subjects come up is parents automatically, and this is well-intentioned parents and good parents, they go to, how can I protect my child from this pain?
Yeah.
Now, and that makes sense that they go there, but what they don't understand is the damage that does. And so it's why I want to back up a little bit and just do a little bit of education for folks.
Great.
And I want to say that when you look at what children need, they can go through terrible, terrible things if they have one safe, trusting relationship that they can count on.
Okay.
So this is what we know about kids is that even terrible traumas, kids can go through those and be resilient if they have a trusting relationship. Now, I'm really trying to drive this home because what often happens when parents are going to talk to their kids about difficult things, the protective part overrides their awareness what my kid really needs is to be able to trust me. And
Mm-hmm.
so many parents lie to their kids about difficult things. And then what happens is those kids actually sense this isn't quite straight. This doesn't
Mm-hmm.
add up. This isn't right. And what they lose is the very most important thing they need to get through it. They lose the trust.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that there's no recovery from.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's really, really hard because you take something like suicide,
Mm-hmm.
parents don't want to. Of course, they don't want to. It's very difficult to talk to kids about
Yeah.
suicide. And so you get a lot of parents lying about suicide. And then what happens is the kids see this incongruence around how their parents are acting and the story they've given the kid. And around, they hear whispers, they hear other stories. And
Mm-hmm.
down the road, chances that the truth come out are so high. And what you've done is devastate your child, because what the child learns is, in the hardest of times, my parent bails. My parent is not honest with me. So
Mm-hmm.
so that means I'm alone when I go through tough stuff, and I learn not to trust anyone. And what we know about trust in relationships is that if a child can't learn to trust their parents and have their parents be trustworthy, it sets that child up for difficulty in relationships from there on out.
Mm-hmm.
So makes it really tough, for them to trust partners when
Yeah.
they get
Okay.
married. And it's just like a rolling stone, the ramifications. It's so sad. And so why I wanted to start here is because I want to say to parents who are listening
Mm-hmm.
that when you look at the loss that comes through telling a child any difficult thing, whether it's about suicide or divorce
Mm-hmm.
or death or any difficult thing,
Mm-hmm.
that nothing is as difficult for the child as losing the fact that they can trust you. Yeah.
And that's great information, because eventually the truth is going to come out
Yes.
with kids, and you can't protect them from everything. And as a parent myself, I totally understand that need, that want, that desire to protect your kids, but you have to just accept early on with parenthood that you can't protect them from everything. Hard things are going to happen. So, death, I would say, is probably one of the most difficult conversations to have with kids, and in particular, really, really young kids, because it can be hard for them to understand they're not coming back.
Mm-hmm.
And death is inevitable. At some point, all kids are going to experience death, whether it's, the loss of a pet is common or the loss of a family member. And I know a lot of parents use religious beliefs to help their children cope and understand. And I wouldn't say that's lying, because if it's a religious belief and it's something you believe strongly in, and so oftentimes helping them to understand, they're living with Jesus now, or they've gone up to heaven and they're in a better place. That's really helpful for helping children to cope. But let's start there. Let's say a parent isn't religious and they don't believe in a life after death, or they don't believe in an afterlife. How do you talk to your kid about death? What do you say to them to help comfort them and help them understand it?
Okay. Great question, Liz. So I think that it's a step by step process. And the first is whatever has happened, whether it's a suicide or
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a death, what you want to give first is information.
Okay.
So You don't want to lie about that. You don't want to
Right.
say, people used to say, oh, grandma went to sleep. And then kids were just so confused. You want to be really clear. And this includes suicide. If
Mm-hmm.
someone has killed themselves, you want to give that child the information
Okay.
that this person killed themselves, and that means they're dead. and
Mm-hmm.
and dead means you won't see them. They won't be alive. You won't see them move. You won't see them talk. They can't do that anymore. They're dead. So you are giving them, this information that while you are on this earth, as
Mm-hmm.
long as you are here, you are not going to see this person. And you don't want to hedge. You don't want to pretend. You don't
Mm-hmm.
want to in any way try and sugarcoat that,
Mm-hmm.
because then what will happen is the child will have a lot of feelings about that.
Okay.
And what the parent can do that is very helpful, parents tend to kind of rush to, how can I solve your feeling?
Mm-hmm.
But what is most helpful is just to hold that feeling with the child. So to
Empathize with them.
acknowledge that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So
Validation.
yeah. So that means, let's say you've had someone, I'm thinking of a case where a father had killed himself.
Okay.
And because the mother didn't want to upset the child, and this was you know, like a 10-year-old boy, she
Mm-hmm.
didn't give the child facts. She didn't
Okay.
tell him dad has killed himself. And what happened is that then the boy stayed really stuck in what's happened. What's happened? This doesn't add up. Why did a policeman come? Why was there
Mm-hmm.
blood? All this confusion. And he couldn't get on with the grieving process.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so he was really stunted in that. So, what you want to do is be really clear, because information helps. It helps put the pieces together. And when you don't have the pieces together, you stay really stuck trying to
Mm-hmm.
make sense. And
Yeah.
little kids do. So you want to put it in words that they can understand. So at their level, and consistently truthful, so that they get all the information. And let's say if you're my child and I have to tell you, dad killed himself, and maybe you just, get up and run around the room, and kids behavior is their way of talking. Or
Okay.
maybe you
Yeah.
cover your ears and start screaming, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
you just start to cry. What I want to do as your parent is, I want to be very calm and say, I can see that you're so sad, or I can see you don't want to hear this, or I can see that this is more than your body can even take. So you just need to run around. And what I don't want to do is try and solve it. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
jump to making that child feel better too fast,
Mm-hmm.
because this, when you look at what parents tend to do, number one, they tend to lie, which hurts the
Mm-hmm.
trust and feel awful. Number two, we see the pain in these little faces that we love in these bodies. We tend to want to make them feel better too fast.
Yeah.
And when we do that, what happens is it gives a kid a message of, it is not okay for you to grieve.
Mm.
And it gives a message of, you cannot handle this hard information. And
Mm-hmm.
I know you can't, because I'm working so hard to make you feel better. And as the parent works so hard to make the child feel better, what happens is the child gets a feeling of, I have to quit feeling the way that I feel. I need to do that for my mom, or else I'm a bad
Mm.
kid. And so they tend to really stuff their feelings, because they can tell that their parent is pushing really hard. I'm going to say that parents in general make the mistake of, one, lying to their kid to out of love and to be protective, but it
Mm-hmm.
ruins the trust. And that's so devastating. And number two, of wanting the kid to move through the pain too fast. And so what the parents do is they nudge it, they push that child, and they do it again out of well-meaning.
Yeah.
But it's not what it does when you move a child too fast. It gives an implicit message of, you can't handle this information. I
Mm-hmm.
know you can't. And so I need to make you feel better fast. And for the child, then they feel, oh, I'm so sad, but I need to not be so sad because my mom can't handle it because I'm so sad. And she's working so hard to make me not feel so sad.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm bad because I feel so sad. Now, a really good example of this is people will say things to the child like, don't feel bad that your daddy died. He's in heaven and you'll see him later.
Mm-hmm.
That is really well meaning.
Mm-hmm.
However, it's devastating.
Okay.
Don't feel bad. That child's devastated. That child is feeling terrible. So don't feel bad. Don't feel what you're feeling. You cannot handle that. You're
Mm-hmm.
not being a good kid because you're feeling it. And what you need to feel is some kind of relief about something that's going to come later because I'm telling you to.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that if you're going to be a good kid and do what I want you to, you need to not process your grief, which will make you a very unhealthy person.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And grief is a process, and all adults have felt grief at some point in their life. And we know that it takes time, and nothing but time can heal those wounds. And kids need that too. And kids may even need more time. And so as I'm listening, it sounds like what could be very helpful is to, first of all, like you said, validate what the child is feeling and continue to validate them, allow them to come back to those feelings at any time and talk to you about it. Let them be open, let them be honest, let them say how they're feeling, and be calm and just listen. And you can even say, I understand that you're feeling this way, and tell them it's okay to feel this way, rather than try to say, oh no, it's okay, you don't have to feel this way anymore. Let them know that yeah, it's normal to feel this way. I feel this way sometimes too.
Yes, you're exactly right, Liz, because that rush to, I think, to have our children get to better emotional spots,
Hmm.
it's so well meant,
Yeah.
but it is devastating. And you look at it, that happens with adults even. I have, heard people come to my office and share stories of like when they've had a significant loss and someone came up to them and said, you're going to feel so much better in a year. Just see. Now that's really well meaning, but they just felt
Yeah.
like screaming because the point is they're in incredible pain now. And this
Hmm.
person is giving a message of, I want you to be somewhere different. This pain of yours is too much for me to hold. And
Hmm.
so you're right. If parents can pace themselves and
Hmm.
not go to that fixing first. And what's interesting is kids will on their own give you cues when
Hmm.
they're ready to step out of it. Kids won't take on more than they can handle. So like that's confusing for parents too,
Okay.
especially around grief. So often when something sad has happened and a parent, shares there's been a death
Hmm.
or something like that, the child might cry and maybe get quiet for a little bit. And then who knows, the child might say, I'm going to run outside and play. And I've had
Hmm.
parents say, what's wrong with my kid? Are they inhuman? Don't they care?
Yeah.
And what children do is if it's too overwhelming, they find a way to take a pause and a break on their own.
Okay.
That's really different than being told by someone else, though, oh, this'll, this'll pass. And,
Hmm.
down the road, you won't even remember how sad you were. things like
Mhm.
that are so meant with to be so compassionate are actually terribly destructive.
Okay. Yeah. And that's really good information too. I would almost say as well that if you do have a traumatic event, particularly in that a suicide, I'm thinking of the example of the father who committed suicide. I would highly recommend getting your kid into counseling at that point,
Mhm.
because that's really traumatic for a kid to go through. And again, like you said, parents, they want to protect their children. And so it can be really hard to give them the emotional support that they need. And kids are going to need a lot of extra emotional support. And so counseling sounds like it would be really, really helpful to help kids work through that, because parenting is hard enough as it is. And then you throw in some traumatic event, some childhood trauma like this, counseling could be a really great resource to help the kid process through it, so you don't carry that on as an adult.
Oh, you are so wise about that, Liz. It's so true. It's
Hmm.
like if something happens when we're little and we don't get a chance to process that, it's almost
Hmm.
like a cancer. And when we grow up, it becomes such a huge issue. It can be a life changing issue.
Yeah.
Whereas if we get a chance to work that through when we're little, it makes all the difference. And I do want to say it's a good time to mention that there are across the country a couple of things you can do for children. And one
Hmm.
is there are grieving groups. And it's
Okay.
really helpful for children to be in grief groups. I know, like in Salt Lake, there's one called the Sharing Place, and up in Washington, there's one called the Dougie Center, and these are all modeled on a certain style of therapy that is really effective and very, I want to say, very helpful for children who are grieving. And so, if anyone listening has a grieving child, I would say try and see if there's a grief group for children in your
Hmm.
area, because one of the things that's so hard is children, when they're going through loss, they feel so alone and they feel different. Like
Hmm.
no one else has had a parent who killed themselves, or no one
Yeah.
else. And so that feeling difference is really hard, and sharing that grief is really positive. So grief groups. And then the other would be to do some individual work with
Hmm.
a therapist. And in particular, I want to say there's a style of play therapy that is especially effective for children. You can even do as young as 2 year olds, but
Okay.
really from 3 to 11 do incredibly well with a style of therapy called child centered play therapy. That's a very effective mode to treat issues that are out of a kid's control. So, issues
Hmm.
like death, and issues like suicide, and issues like divorce and illness, when kids get cancer and things like that. So that's something just for listeners to be aware of.
Yeah, and they could probably find access to those resources through a pediatrician's office, or even probably through a school. I remember doing counseling with the school counselor, being pulled out of school by a counselor, and sitting and talking about, just things that were going on in my kid life that my mom thought counseling would be helpful for, and it was. So we're almost out of time. So real quick, I wanted to hit on talking to kids about sexuality, because this can be another really hard one to talk through with kids, and
Mhm.
particularly from a religious standpoint. And I think if religion isn't in your life, it's a little bit easier to talk to kids about sexuality. But I have noticed from a religious standpoint, parents often want to talk to kids, and there's often shame involved. And I don't think parents are trying to do it intentionally, but often, particularly in terms of exploration, like physical exploration, it's very, very natural and normal for kids to explore, and for them to touch themselves and to do that. And so oftentimes what parents will say is, "Oh, don't do that. That's bad," or, that's inappropriate. And so I guess a specific question and something I've even wondered about myself is from a religious standpoint, how can we talk to our kids and help them understand our viewpoints and help them understand from a religious perspective about maybe in particular masturbation and how that's not acceptable without shaming them about it? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, you're opening up a nice big hot button area for a lot of people right now.
Hmm.
So I want to say, and I like your awareness that first, all people masturbate. They do. This is just a fact. If you look at all little ones, they all
Hmm.
masturbate. They all discover their genital areas.
Hmm.
And those areas feel good and they're meant to feel good.
Right.
And so when you look at it, if you're a religious person, the idea that God would be angry at children for touching parts of their body that he gave them that
Hmm.
feel good, that just seems kind of ludicrous to me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so, and to think that any child could be sinning by touching themselves, again, that feels ludicrous to me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and you're right that a whole lot of damage, the damage that gets done about guilting people, about natural physical responses, it's really tragic because
Hmm.
when people are shamed a lot around self-pleasuring,
Hmm.
what they develop this sense of, oh, this is bad. That means my body's bad. And that
Hmm.
means sex is bad. I just want to say an interesting thing. I was at a sex therapy conference, and the presenter said, one of the highest indicators for a woman to have a healthy sexual life in her marriage is if she actually did a lot of masturbating along the way and wasn't shamed about that growing up.
Hmm.
So she got to feel like, oh, this is how my body feels good. And I know what it likes. And this is safe. And, when you look at it, it kind of, especially religions, of course, don't want, say, young people having sex with each other. It's kind
Hmm.
of interesting because self-pleasuring is one way of taking care of those urges and needs without violating, some of those moral laws.
Hmm.
So each parent has to figure out how they feel about that. But I think the main thing is when you see a child masturbating, because little ones will do that, a lot of
Hmm.
parents do this scolding thing. And that's just terrible. That's devastating. And that teaches your child, my body is bad
Hmm.
and I feel shame about it. And when you combine something like shame and sexuality, what you're setting your child up for is sexual problems the rest of their life. But also, when people feel shame around an issue, they tend to have a lot more tendency to develop obsessive behaviors. So, issue
Hmm.
like things like turning to porn, things like that.
Yeah.
I want to say those kind of early hooks, I think, often happen around, I've learned that this is so shameful and so bad, and yet it feels good. So what I do is go on to, oh, this is a way to be shameful and bad, and it feels good. It kind of plays out that story I learned very young. That's the
Hmm.
opposite from a parent who can see their child touching their genital area and say, oh, I see you're wanting to make, and it's helpful to use the actual proper terms talking to kids. I see you're
Yeah.
wanting to make your penis feel good. And penises feel good when they're touched. That,
Hmm.
because then that's true. I get it. And that's one way of feeling good. And then what you can do, rather than send your child off or shaming them, is you can say, I wonder if there's some other ways we could help you feel good right now. So just adding an and around connection. Like, I
Okay.
wonder if you would like to read a story with me and I could tickle your back. And that's another way to feel good.
Hmm.
So this is with little ones. Just so notice there's no shaming. There's no, you need to do that somewhere else. There's no sending you away. It's, I'm acknowledging this feels good. and we can feel good together this other way.
That's great. Yeah, that's a really great tip, particularly from someone who feels like from a religious standpoint that, masturbation is morally wrong, and there are parents who feel that way, and I think that's a really great alternative to shaming, and it almost in a way feels foreign to a lot of parents to acknowledge, oh, that it feels good to touch your vagina, or it feels good to touch your penis. That sounds really foreign because it sounds like we're encouraging it, but really it's just, again, validating. I can't tell you how many times, even Dr. Burton and I have talked about validating feelings, and kids need validation too. And so validating, yeah, that feels good, doesn't it? And then giving them an alternative. That sounds like a really perfect solution. So, Lindy, this has been a great conversation, and we've been given a lot of really useful information. I hope that we can have you back again. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
You're welcome, Liz. It's a pleasure.
All right. Next week, we are going to talk about navigating difficult opinions in relationships. So, the particular things that Dr. Burton and I are going to hit is when you have religious differences and political differences in relationships. So, stay tuned for that, and we will talk to you all next week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.